Controlled contagion experiments are fundamentally the gold standard of how we can determine whether or not germs cause disease. This was the whole basis of Koch's postulates. Try and create a logical set of criteria to meet to prove that germs cause illness. One of the fundamental criteria, introducing a germ into a healthy host, into a healthy person, and causing the exact set of symptoms or symptoms at all, and this has never been conducted. Direct experimental observation is the highest form of proof, and of course, this must adhere to some sort of logic. Throughout history, there have been hundreds of controlled contagion experiments, and time again, they fail. Available in the Beyond Terrain community is a full terrain studies library where we continue to compile every single study that we can find that complements and supports the terrain paradigm. Within this, we have tons of failed contagion experiments, so make sure you go join the community to get access to the terrain studies library. It is all very simply laid out and categorized, it's searchable so that you can go in and easily find the studies to support your arguments. Today, we're not talking about theories, we're talking about the gold standard experiments that should prove contagion and germ theory to be true and correct, where we introduce germs to healthy people and where disease manifests. But in reality, what happens is absolutely nothing. Healthy people get inoculated with germs and nothing happens, no symptoms get produced. The only way to produce symptoms, add in some sort of toxicity to the mix, giving unisolated germs to people. When you introduce a germ with a toxicity side by side, you get symptoms. This is because the toxicity, of course, is the true cause of disease. And this was the reason for Koch's postulates. So Koch's postulates were definite scientific criteria that should be met to prove the causation of a germ. Postulate 1, you must find the organism in all cases of disease. Postulate 2, you must isolate this organism and grow it in some sort of culture, in a pure form. Postulate 3, you must take this germ, introduce it into a healthy person, and cause the same symptoms that were observed when you isolated the germ in the first postulate. And postulate number 4, the germ must be re-isolated and suspended in a culture once again to show that it was the germ in fact causing the illness. These postulates are routinely ignored as they are unattainable. Admittedly so. Rather than rejecting the germ theory and admitting a falsification of the theory, what was necessary to keep the germ theory alive was the use of indirect tools, PCR, genomics, serological assays, and even cultures, cell cultures, cytopathic effect studies, to try to prove that germs cause disease. Since Koch's postulates have never been met, they've never been attained, we have rejected Koch's postulates and say that they don't actually fit the germ theory. But the Koch's postulates are a logical set of postulates. They make pure sense. If you introduce the germ in isolation and it causes disease every time, then yes, germs would cause disease. That would be fundamental criteria met. Everyone should accept that. But in good Popperian fashion, if you falsify hypothesis over and over and again, and experiments fail time and time again, then you must reject the hypothesis and reject the theory that lays on that hypothesis as a foundation. Now, postulate 1 and 2 can certainly be met, but postulate number 3, reintroduction of the germ itself into a healthy host to cause disease, has absolutely never been attained. And of course, these criteria do not apply to virology. We've thrown that out a long time ago, but viruses, of course, do not exist, and you can go watch that video here. There's no objective evidence whatsoever to state that these exist outside of the laboratory. And there's tons of literature out there that suggests that we should reject Koch's postulates, even when it comes to things like parasitology or bacteriology, microbiology in general, because it is impossible to meet them. Because what we observe in nature does not adhere to Koch's postulates. So the germ theory does not adhere to logic. And this is a really important point to stress. The germ theory itself is fundamentally illogical, and it contradicts the first law of logic, the law of non-contradiction. This fundamental axiom, the law of non-contradiction, A and not A cannot exist at the same time. Something cannot be blue all over and green all over in the same fashion, in the same time, in the same place. Something cannot exist and both not exist simultaneously. So a germ cannot both cause disease and not cause disease at the same time. Right? This is a contradiction. And the asymptomatic host, right? The presence of a disease without the presence of symptoms is one of the post hoc backfills that the germ theory must utilize, which is illogical, to continue to perpetuate this absolute nonsense, this illogical garbage. The asymptomatic host postulates exactly that germs both cause disease and don't cause disease. And what this actually alludes to is that it is the terrain itself that causes the virulence, that causes the pathogenicity, that causes the symptoms, that causes the disease. And of course, this is observed and backed up completely by the literature. This has been discussed for virology ad nauseum and is very clear when it comes to bacteriology as well. Let us now look at a few failed contagion studies. So the first study that I learned about, one of the most convincing studies that I ever read that actually fundamentally disallowed me from continuing in believing in the germ theory, was the Rosenau Studies in 1918. These are the Galapagos Island studies on influenza. They took more than 100 Navy volunteers and they wanted to determine the method and the spread and the contagious nature of influenza, of the flu, right? In this case, it was a pandemic. How some germs cause pandemics and some don't. Again, a little bit of a contradiction, although explained out with the old species dilemma. But as we know from this video, microbial species are more based on the indirect nonsense of modern laboratory technology than it is a fundamental reality. Nevertheless, they exposed these healthy Navy volunteers to tons of different methods of contagion, natural transmission routes and unnatural transmission routes. They did everything from exposing these healthy prisoners to very sick influenza patients, direct contact, breath directly in the face for multiple minutes at a time, transferring mucus directly from sick people into healthy people, sneezing, saliva, close proximity, you name it. They actually even tried to use inoculation and injections to transfer the influenza, right? So they even used blood. Not a single healthy Navy volunteer was sick in this study. Not a single one. There will be a link down below to this paper. Rosenau himself did conclude that this was a failed experiment, that he failed to transfer the disease, thus fundamentally falsifying contagion. With a Popperian perspective, a true empirical perspective, falsification is the fundamental criteria for rejecting a hypothesis, for rejecting a theory. The germ theory should have been rejected long ago because this was not the first experiment. In the Beyond Terrain community, there is an 11-module course on parasites. Module 7 fundamentally covers every single human control experiment with parasites that I could find. We go in depth explaining out every single one of them. If you can find an original paper published, a human controlled experiment on parasites that is not in module 7, I will absolutely give you a free month of the membership, but I think I've done a pretty comprehensive job of researching all of those papers. Regardless, they do go back a little bit further when it comes to things like exposure of helminths, of protozoa, of sick tissue. None of it ever causes disease. Now, the original point of the papers back in the late 1800s were to try to prove and understand transmission itself. But again, no symptoms were ever produced in these experiments. And although in parasitology there might be exogenous colonization of organisms, fundamental creation of disease from the introduction of a purified organism has never and will never occur, because the germ theory is falsified, it's nonsense, it is illogical, it is not a reflection of reality. I'll only mention a few experiments in this video today, but again, this has been reproduced multiple times. Influenza is honestly one of the most reproduced failed contagion experiments, but it has occurred with almost every disease because, of course, now it's impossible to do a controlled human exposure experiment. Although there are some human challenge studies when it comes to the exposure of parasites, interestingly enough, because they're trying to develop little injections. But Burnet and Foley in 1940 tried to transmit influenza and it failed. Once again, of course, they used university students this time. They inoculated these healthy individuals with virus material, with, the sputum and the samples taken from sick individuals through direct contact, tissue culture fluid. They directly tried to transmit the illness. Once again, no successful illness occurred. 0 to 15. If you add up all the studies of failed contagion experiments, you do actually get up pretty high participant numbers. Oftentimes when you read the history, it's often scientists taking the germs just themselves, crazy scientists trying to ingest the germs to cause illness. Sometimes they do it on family, sometimes they do it on, low, n equals 1, 2, 3 experiments, but it adds up over time as a falsification, right? And we can observe this out in the real world as well, right? You get exposed to people who are sick and you don't get sick, obviously. This happens more often than being exposed to sick people and getting sick, which, again, it doesn't tell us that much scientifically, but it's something to consider. Again, the conclusion of this paper was failure. Experiment was a failure. No proof of transmission has ever occurred in the literature. One thing that people usually get stuck up on is sexually transmitted illnesses. It seems, oh, STIs, it's so clear that these cause disease, that this is contagious, You have a sexual partner and then they get sick. But, this whole train of contagious and being able to track it from person to person, this all relies on the asymptomatic nonsense. You do not have a direct chain of symptoms. You have a direct chain of positive tests, but the tests are absolutely unscientific. They're unreliable, they're insensitive. PCR is random, and serology is totally non-specific and detects only a response, if that, because it can detect many other things than antibodies. Syphilis and gonorrhea in the 1950s, there were some super unethical studies done. This is really one of the fundamental papers that needs to be read by every single microbiologist, every single infectious biologist, every single doctor, every single scientist in the world should read these papers. But of course, even when confronted with them, they use their storytelling and backfill ability to create a narrative that, really tries to push all the pieces in together, to force all the pieces in together. But of course, none of those explanations rely on real world observation. We're so deep in the storybook that we just have to close the book, throw it out and burn it. So US Public Health Service studies in Guatemala, these were conducted on prisoners. Once again, these prisoners were exposed to prostitutes. This prostitution was a big problem, so was the symptoms of syphilis and gonorrhea. They were big problems in Guatemala, and so that's where US scientists decided to go and study this phenomenon, right? And this was in the 50s, so they could kind of get away with some unethical stuff. Men were deliberately exposed to infected individuals. They were forced to, well, I don't know how much they had to force them, but they were told to have intercourse with prostitutes who were displaying symptoms of syphilis and gonorrhea. After so many failed attempts at transmission, they could not produce transmission. They tried so hard. Again, they used the Rosenau methods, every single method under the sun, unnatural or natural transmission conditions. They still couldn't prove any transmission whatsoever. So they actually went and they abraded the tips of the penises of the prisoners and then made them or told them to have intercourse with prostitutes who displayed symptoms. Even with abraded penises, they could not produce the disease. No one in those experiments got syphilis or gonorrhea, even after known exposure through natural and unnatural methods to individuals who displayed the symptoms. No one got sick. The whole experiment was touted as an absolute failure, a waste of money, and I don't really know what happened to that scientist, but he probably lost his job. There are literally hundreds of papers of documented case reports of people being intentionally exposed with isolated pathogens, with isolated germs, parasites, bacteria, supposedly viruses, in quotations, because they do not exist. And there are a bunch of studies out there as well that introduce germs with other toxins, and they are able to produce disease. But they can only produce disease in individuals when they add toxicity. This is the whole idea of why when they give injections to people, they need to add some sort of adjuvant, right? Some sort of heavy metal, like aluminum, right? Some sort of toxicity to stimulate the immune system. But it's actually the body just responding to toxicity. It's not the body responding to any sort of germ or virus or whatever. Once again, a list of failed contagion studies, as well as a ton of other studies that support the Terrian paradigm, is available in the Beyond Terrain community. $29 to be a founding member. You get a 30-minute onboarding call. There's no reason not to join. You lock in the low price for life. 11 module course on parasites, classrooms on lifestyle, movement, reflections, live calls, Q&As, and a community of like-minded individuals to chat with, to learn from, to learn with, to grow with, and to become the best version of yourself. So go and join. So of course from here, this is where the asymptomatic carrier fundamentally comes from, but of course now it comes from much greater problems. the use of PCR, the use of serology and antibodies. But this is backfill, right? So what we have is we created a theory. Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur and all these guys, Edward Jenner, they all created the theory, the germ theory, before they had the evidence. And this is how it always goes in science. They create the theory and then they try to fit the theory to the studies, to the experiments, to the observations after the matter. And when inevitably the theory is falsified, because the theories serve only the vested interests, you don't just outright reject the theory because you spent so much time publicizing it and trying to instill it into people's minds. What you do is you then backfill, you go back and you create all of these stories and conditions to say, oh, well, germs don't always cause disease. It depends on the immune system of the host. Well, of course, that's nonsense and it's backfill, and immune studies are absolute nonsense, have no foundation or logic to them. You can go learn more about the immune system here. And when you violate logical Koch's postulates, again, you have to reject Koch's postulates, say that the postulates were faulty because, of course, the observations didn't fit the theory. You say that people are asymptomatic. You say that germs sometimes cause disease and sometimes they don't. It's just total nonsense. So modern tools to confirm the presence of pathogens in people who are sick include mostly PCR and serology. We use antibody tests and we use genomic tests to try to prove the presence of a pathogen. This is most problematic in virology because it perpetuates this idea that viruses exist, in which they do not. It also perpetuates this idea that germs cause illness because germs are present at the site of disease. We think that germs are the cause of disease, when in fact they are bystanders, they are the cleanup crew, they are part of the detoxification role in the body. Serology assumes antibodies are specific. They are indeed non-specific. They're cross-reactive. You can go and learn more about that in this video. PCR is almost random, to be quite honest with you. It depends completely on the methods used to set up. Not all PCR tests, or not all laboratories who run PCR set it up in the same way. You can completely alter the results by altering the fundamental gauges and conditions of the test of the programs themselves. But at the very least, you can accept that both of these methods do work properly, and you still must reject the germ theory. Because if anything, they detect the presence of microbes even when people aren't sick. So it still rests on illogical arguments. So disease does not spread, it expresses. Disease must express itself. It must manifest. When you are deficient or you are toxic, disease must come out, right? It has to come out. Your body must rejuvenate itself. This is what the body is designed to do. The body is not designed to fight off foreign invaders and microbial terrorists. It is designed to detoxify and rejuvenate itself. Microbes and symptoms are responses. They are not causes. If you want to learn more about this, go join the Beyond Training community. You can join for free, but I highly recommend you join as a founding member. No reason not to. You get more value than you deserve for $29 a month. The price will only go up as we continue to grow and build. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss being a founding member. All of germ theory has been falsified. The foundation that it rests on has been completely disproved. The gold standard experiments, objective observation of reality completely disproves germ theory. This has not just occurred once, this occurs time and time again. If you accept the empirical tradition, you must accept the germ theory has been falsified. Otherwise, you will be rejecting fundamental principles of empiricism. So that can be fine. If you want to live in la la land and reject logic and empiricism, that's fine, but you're not living in reality. And if you want to live in fairy tale land, that's fine by me, but stay away from me. When you apply logic, direct testing, direct observation of reality, the germ theory collapses, but what remains is the terrain. Hope you guys enjoyed this mini lecture. Like, comment, subscribe, share, whatever you got to do, help support the channel grow. Appreciate you guys. Take care.